So now for tonight's speaker, Emiko Davies, originally from Canberra, Australian Japanese, raised internationally because her father was a diplomat, or mother, one or the other, father. And then eventually she arrived here in Florence 17 years ago, 2005, to work in art restoration. And she says that she fell in love with a Tuscan sommelier, and that was that really. And so she stayed, and she transformed into becoming a highly successful food writer with a big following both here in Italy and around the world through her journalism and her cookbooks. We got in touch following on from the visit of Sarah Winman, who was here for a Meet the Author session with her wonderful book, Still Life, just before Christmas. And Sarah told me that she'd been advised to get the historical food in Santo Spirito in the 50s and the 60s right by none other than Emiko. And you said, Simon, you really need to meet Emiko. So here we all are. So that's how it goes down. Yep, so I'm going to now pass la parola a Emiko for her lecture. Thank you.
Oh, yeah, thank you. I need that. Buonasera a tutti. Thank you for coming. At first glance, British food and Florentine food seem to have very little in common. But when I was asked for a topic for tonight's lecture at the British Institute of Florence, I thought it might be fun to see some of the connections between these two cultures through food. These are things that I've come across over the many years of researching. Yes, I will get closer to the microphone. Better. These are just some things that I've come across over the many years researching Florentine history and through food. And I have personally always been very curious about this intersection between expats and the city that they choose to live in, as I have basically been an expat for at least 30 years of my life, and 17 of those have been here. I was born in Australia. I have a Japanese mother and an Australian father, and we lived for many years in China. I went to art school in the States and then came to Florence as an art restoration student, as Simon mentioned. And I've always been very, very interested in history. I started writing about food history in 2010, and that's what led to starting to write cookbooks. And I now have 5 cookbooks about regional Italian cuisine. I think that the first thing that I find really interesting is that in a small city like Florence, there is a really large international community. And if you look at the second half of the 1800s, which is where we're going to be for most of this talk, this is a really significant time for Florentine food culture, as a very important cookbook was also written in the second half of the 1800s. So we'll get back to that soon. But this is a time when Florence was filled with English and American expatriates. There seemed to be a particular lure for writers and creative types who would come to Florence. And foreigners made up 1/3 of Florence's population of 200,000 people at that time. And about 30,000 of these were Anglophones. To compare that to today, there are about 360,000 residents in Florence, about 1.2% are British, so it's about 700, and about just less than that are American. So in the 1800s, this was the place to be if you were a British expat. And I think that it really is only natural that those foreigners who loved Florence and probably came here for the art and the culture, but probably also for the climate and the food, that they leave some kind of imprint here as well. One way you'll see this is simply through the language. It's often, it's long been thought that the word bistecca comes from the word beefsteak. And I think that roast beef sort of speaks for itself, roast beef. Plum cake is another one that has remained in the Italian vocabulary as a general term for any sort of pound cake, regardless of whether or not plums are actually present. And I think that the person who has a lot to do with this is Artusi. For those who don't know Artusi, Pellegrino Artusi lived in Florence for most of his life. He had a lovely house in Piazza d'Azeglio. And he self-published this cookbook when he was in his 70s. It was 1891. It's called Science in the Kitchen and the Art of Eating Well. It is well considered the first Italian cookbook, as it was written only 3 decades after Italy's unification, and it became an enormous success. Every household in the peninsula has a copy, and it is still in print. The latest edition has got a preface by Massimo Bottura. It contains 790 recipes, and many of these are Tuscan, but the idea with this cookbook is it doesn't really distinguish between the regions. It's not a regional cookbook, and for that reason, that's why it's considered the very first Italian cookbook. Artusi is also then known as the great-grandfather of Italian cuisine because of this book, and he is even credited with helping the newly formed Italian Republic with learning Italian. The editor of the 1970 edition of Science in the Kitchen, Piero Camporesi, goes as far to suggest that it was Artusi's cookbook that helped bring the country and its diverse dialects together into one national language, more than any politician managed to do at the time. And Gillian Riley, in the Oxford Companion to Italian Food, paints this picture. While the questione della lingua was being debated by academics, innocent housewives throughout the land were consulting their Artusi every day, and his literate, slightly colloquial Florentine version of Tuscan became reassuringly familiar. One thing he changed, for example, were common cookery words. So he actually has a glossary in the back of his cookbook. I have a copy of it here if anyone wants to have a look at that later. And in this glossary, he's got things like food words that non-Tuscans may not have been familiar with. For example, the names of vegetables like bietola, which is silver beet. And this was something that's often known simply as erbe, herbs, in other places in Italy. Strutto or lard or pig's fat is known by other names in other regions. The word pietra, stone, which is used to describe kidneys, are also called rene rognone or agnone in other parts of Italy. He lists also kitchen utensils in this Tuscan glossary, so that words like the chopping board, the spianatoia, or the mestolo, the wooden spoon, he uses their Tuscan names throughout the cookbook. And this way people became familiar with these. Even the cuts of meat that he refers to in the book are described by their Tuscan versions as well. And these words have remained in the modern Italian language. In short, Artusi is following in the footsteps of Dante Alighieri and the other writers of Florence by marking the Tuscan dialect as the national Italian language. The other interesting thing about Artusi's cookbook is that it is peppered with British recipes. He notes all of these as all'inglese, in the English style. There are recipes for ribes all'inglese. These are black currants, which are simply stewed with sugar and water. He's got mele all'inglese, English style apples. Artusi says you could call it a pasticcio di mele. This is basically like an apple pie or an apple crumble. You just finely slice the apples. You cook them with sugar, cinnamon, water. He adds some candied citrus in there. And then you pour it into a ceramic dish, cover it with pastry and bake it. It's like an apple pie. Then of course there's the plum cake that I mentioned earlier. And then there is also quattro quarti all'inglese, which is an actual pound cake. It has currants in it as well. The plum cake recipe is quite similar to the pound cake. They both call for equal amounts of butter, sugar, flour, and 5 eggs. But the plum cake is full of candied fruit, raisins, and rum. No doubt the name plum cake comes from the raisins, where like in English plum pudding, which is also in the cookbook, it was a pre-Victorian term for raisins, or sort of an umbrella term for all dried fruit. In the plum pudding recipe, Artusi immediately notes in the head note that there are no prunes or plums present in the cake, despite its name. Artusi also has a recipe for piccione all'inglese, English style pigeon. And in his head note, he gives it an alternative title, pigeon paio. When I was first reading this recipe, I thought, what an odd name. But it wasn't until I read it out loud to my husband. I said, what do you think about this recipe? He calls it pigeon paio. And I realized that was just Artusi's Italianization of pigeon pie. And the introduction to this recipe made me laugh as well. He says, I will warn you now that in my kitchen, we don't question names, and I don't give importance to pompous titles. If an English person says that this dish, which also goes by the strange name of pichon paio, isn't prepared according to the way it is done in their nation, non mi importa un fico. I couldn't care less. All that matters is it is deemed good. The recipe is an ancient one and a well-known one in England. You have a large young pigeon. It is quartered. You layer it in a pie dish, and it has alternate layers of veal. In some old recipes, it's a steak. You'll see in this one pieces of steak. This is the one here on the top is from a cookbook from 1954, Dorothy Hartlett's Food in England. And the one from 1900, which is this one on the right here, is basically identical to Artusi's recipe when you read the actual recipe. It has boiled egg slices in it, and then it's covered with a broth and then a puff pastry on top, and it is baked. Artusi actually suggests at the end of this recipe, to make it more Italian, you could add chicken livers, sweetbreads, and truffles. Another recipe that has Inglese in the title is crema inglese, or literally that means English cream. What it is a light pouring custard. Artusi recommends it as a base for gelato alla crema, or as a rather liquid zuppa inglese, and that's another recipe that I will get on to in a moment as well. What makes crema inglese different from regular crema or the pastry cream or crema pasticcera is that it doesn't have any flour or starch in it. It just relies on eggs to thicken it. What's quite interesting is that this Bible of Italian cuisine, Artusi even shares the recipe for the very traditional English dish, toad in the hole, which is, usually you see it now with sausages and Yorkshire pudding batter. But historically, it was also made with steak or kidney or other meats such as pigeon as well. In fact, Artusi calls this dish lesso rifatto all'inglese. The lesso rifatto is, boiled meat redone. And he does have fun translating this name in his head note to this recipe, calling it the rospo nella tana, the toad in the hole. And I'm not sure if this recipe actually ever caught on in Italy. It's not something that you see here now at all. But I would think that this piatto squisito, as Artusi calls it, would have appealed to Italian housewives too, because the Tuscans love a good lesso rifatto, and they have many versions of it themselves. British puddings also feature in this cookbook. There are semolina puddings, budino di semolina, which would have been an easy crossover, but there is also the apple charlotte, a brilliant English pudding for using stale bread and making it into a tasty dish by adding sugar and apples. Artusi includes also butter and cinnamon. That's the pouring cream that you see there as well. So that's the crema inglese. And he has a recipe too for pastine per tè, tea cookies. This is a recipe given to him by an English woman that he calls Mistress Wood, a lovable English signora, which is basically a recipe for traditional shortbread. It's got fine flour and starch. It's mixed with powdered sugar, butter, and egg whites. It's rolled, cut into rounds, and then pricked with a fork and baked. But there is another recipe of Artusi's that I have always found intriguing, because this is just something that you don't see here now. It's called dolce Firenze, sweet Florence, or Florence's dessert. He also has recipes for a dolce Roma and a dolce Torino in this book. And he explains this name as this. He says that he came across this dish in Florence and it had no name. So he ventured to name it after the beautiful and antique city where he first tasted it. Although it won't honor the illustrious city, he says, the humble dessert can excuse itself because it's a good family dish and it'll satisfy sweet tooths for relatively little cost. So basically what you have in this dolce Firenze is toasted bread, buttered on both sides, and laid in a dish suitable for presenting at the table. Sultanas and lemon zest are sprinkled over, and then a batter of blended eggs, sugar, and milk is poured over the top, and it's baked. It's bread and butter pudding. Artusi's name for this dessert never caught on, and neither did the dish, as it's unheard of in Florence, which is surprising for a city that is so very good at using leftover bread. When I made this dolce Firenze for my Tuscan mother-in-law to try, she was immediately enamored of it, and thought that this delightful new foreign dish was fantastic. She asked me to translate the recipe, and I just said, don't worry, it's in Artusi. Finally, there's another curious English recipe in this book, which is right towards the end. It's a cocktail recipe, and it's called Claret Cup. Artusi has in brackets next to that, Bibite Inglese, an English drink. Claret Cup is a punch. You could think of it as the British sangria. Some think it's the precursor to the Pimm's Cup. It was an immensely popular drink for British parties in the 1800s, when everyone had their own spin on this recipe. And today, I'm not sure if many bartenders actually even know what claret is, but it used to be a name for the wines of the Bordeaux region in France. And it just eventually became like an umbrella term for red wine in general. So Artusi describes in the recipe headnote that it deserves to be included in the book because it is very pleasant and it's very easy to make. He notes that you can use Bordeaux, Chianti, or Sangiovese for this recipe. He adds the wine to a simple syrup of water and sugar, lemon juice, and then he serves it watered down with ice in the summer. So this is just a little look at some of the British recipes in Artusi's book, which is one of the most influential cookbooks in Italian cuisine. And of these, the only one that remains actually a fixture in Florentine cuisine is the roast beef that I mentioned at the beginning. This is something that you can find everywhere. From the supermarket, you can buy it, it's already made, and they'll slice it there for you. You can buy it you can find it in a trattoria, you'll find it in people's homes. The roast beef caught on. The other recipes, maybe not, but I still find it really curious that a cookbook like this, which is so revered in Italian cuisine, has so many British recipes in it. I wanted to now look at 3 particular dishes, and these are all dishes that you can find in Florence. Bistecca alla Fiorentina. This is like the pride and joy of Florence's cuisine. It is an enormous, very thick, several fingers thick T-bone steak. It is always grilled, strictly rare. The slab of meat, at least 1 kilo in weight, is brought to the table and sliced around the bone into chunks for easy sharing. You often have side dishes of roast potatoes, cannellini beans, or garlic scented greens, accompanied by lots of crusty bread to mop up the juices. As I said, the pride and joy of Florence's cuisine. But the origins of bistecca, as well as its name, may not be so local. To find out a bit more, I consulted a mix of dictionaries, butchers, and 19th century cookbooks. Florentines will claim that this dish has been around for centuries. There is a very popular legend that describes the Medici family holding a huge feast for the citizens of Florence in the Piazza of San Lorenzo in 1565. They called these carbonate, from the word for charcoal, carbone. So good were the steaks, the story goes, that a group of visiting Englishmen chanted for more beefsteak, and that was Italianized to bistecca. Pellegrino Artusi uses this, not the story, but he notes that bistecca is adopted from an English word in his cookbook. However, a very good friend of mine, my butcher, Andrea Falaschi at Macelleria Sergio Falaschi in San Miniato, he had another idea, which I thought was very interesting too. He thought that bistecca could easily be a Latin word coming from bis, which means two, and stecca, which means a stick, or literally the bone. And it's literally describing the steak split into by the stick, bistecca. After a bit of etymology investigation, I think it seems unlikely that a group of Englishmen were shouting for beefsteak, actually, when this word beef actually comes from the French word via Latin for an ox, and the word steak comes from a Scandinavian word for roasting, to be roasted. And that more likely came about in 18th century England. And in fact, the 18th or 19th century is more likely when the Italian word bistecca came about too. And it's quite possible that it came about anyway from the English community in Florence at the time. Paolo Petroni, a Florentine and one of Tuscany's most well-known food writers, thinks that the Medici legend is totally false. And he cites Pietro Fanfani's Vocabolario dell'uso toscano, this is a Tuscan dictionary of 1863, which describes the word bistecca as a newly coined word. So in 1863, this dictionary was saying this is a really new word. And this is a period, as we've discussed, that saw a great number of British people making Florence their home. Interestingly, I find this really interesting, he notes this bit here, that this steak is poco arrostita sulla gratella. So it is not very cooked and it's cooked on a grill. This brings me to the preparation of actually grilling the steak, because quite possibly this isn't something Italian at all. This is something definitely British. So there is plenty of evidence that the English have long been considered the masters of beef. They've been breeding cattle for meat. Many people acknowledge that this was created, invented in Britain. The French have even nicknamed the British roast beef for this. There is a film called Steak Revolution. It's a documentary that investigates the best steak in the world. And the director, Frank Ribier, said, we've only been eating grilled meat in France for the past 30 years, whereas you roast beefs have been doing so since the 16th century and have bred cows for that very purpose. So it's only natural that you have had a head start. And he compares the type of cooking that is better known in France, braises and stews, pot au feu, beef bourguignon, these kind of dishes, to a simply grilled steak. And I think that this could easily be said of Italy as well. I'm going to put forward an idea here, which is also, I mean, this isn't sustained by anybody else. This is just me putting two and two together. But before I go into this next part, which is that the British basically invented grilled meat, I do think there might be a little connection here that could make this a strictly Florentine tradition, not a wider Italian one. And maybe something that grew on its own, perhaps with the help again of the British in Florence, but that definitely places this, this Medici legend that happened in the 16th century. So the Medicis were performing these carbonate feasts in Piazza San Lorenzo in front of their parish church. They did it on August 10th, which is the patron saint day of San Lorenzo. It is still a day that is much celebrated here in Florence in honor of St. Lawrence. Does anyone happen to know how St. Lawrence was martyred? He was grilled. I know it's kind of a morbid thought. This is in San Lorenzo. This is a painting by Bronzino. There he is on the grill. He famously said, "I'm done on this side, now turn me over and do the other." It is rather morbid, but the similarity is uncanny, don't you think? So the English have been breeding cattle for centuries, over 5 centuries, specifically for meat. Whereas in Italy, which has a landscape and a society more adept at raising sheep and pigs than cows, their hardy cattle have always been first and foremost a working animal and eaten really only once it was not fit to work anymore. So the only way to make this meat edible and digestible was to boil it for a really long time. You have grilled beef in this sense could be a really relatively new addition to the menu. When it comes to the native Tuscan breed, Chianina, as we have here, this is especially so. Chianina are an extraordinarily muscular cow. They are very, very lean. They are the perfect working animal. But in order to eat them, you have to treat the meat just so. It has to be al sangue. You cannot cook this meat more than rare. Otherwise, it's like chewing on a boot. flipping through a battered 1910 edition of an Italian cooking manual by Caterina Prato. This was originally published in 1858. I found a diagram of beef cuts where the lombata, or the sirloin, that's the top part right there. The lombata she describes as ideal for roast beef or to be cut for bistecca to the thickness of a thumb. Today's bistecca alla fiorentina, I will say, they're quite thick. They are like 3 fingers thick. Artusi's bistecca are only 2 centimeters thick. So there was a difference. She says to cut these bistecca to the thickness of a thumb, and she describes how to cook these bistecche all'inglese in the English style on an enamel pan, leaving them pink inside for steaks that are not only juicy, but easy to digest. And I think that you'll see that that's quite a striking resemblance to today's bistecca alla fiorentina with a hint of English blood. The other dish that I wanted to tell you about is curry. So this may not strike you as either Florentine or British, but there is a connection to both here, and there is a connection specifically that makes this a particularly Florentine dish. So for the record, curry is an ancient South Asian preparation. It's been known in India since at least 2000 BC. But curry powder in the form of a blend of spices first made its way to Britain from India in the 18th century by the colonial government. And it is first described in an English cookbook from 1747 by Hannah Glasser. This is The Art of Cookery Made Plain and Easy. Curry powder became commercially available at the end of that century. And that is something that makes British Indian curry slightly different from a traditional curry. They use a blend of ready, ground spices, whereas Indian cooks would traditionally prepare their own curry paste and blends using whole spices. From the early 1800s, curry was served in coffee houses in Britain, and it was enormously popular. There was a curry house in every town. Even Queen Victoria was a fan. There's a cookbook from 1852 that states few dinners are thought complete unless one is on the table. And its popularity shot up even more so during and after the Second World War. This was a time when bombed out cafes were bought very cheaply, and curries, which were adapted to British tastes, could be found alongside fish and chips and pies. Post-war is around the same time that you begin to see it in Florence, when it was a highly requested dish from British visitors and expats. Harry's Bar, some of you may be familiar with. It is just here on the other side of the river. It opened up in Florence in December 1953 and moved, it was in Via del Parione, it moved to its current location on the Lung'Arno in 1963. One of the dishes you can still find on their iconic menu is for curry. And it has, it's either you can have a choice of chicken or prawns, served with rice pilaf and a mango chutney on the side. Actually, the one that I showed you, that's Harry's Bar right there, Harry's Bar Firenze. And this is a very, very mild curry. It is very delicate and very creamy. In fact, it's made with pure cream. The chicken or the prawns are dusted first in flour and then fried in oil. You add a splash of cognac, you add the cream, and then you add this curry sauce, which is made with a blended, it's a blended sauce of onion, apple, curry powder, a splash of white wine, another of cognac and vegetable stock. And then that's all blended till smooth and added to the dish. The sauce gets cooked down and blended, and then it's served with this sweet, jammy mango chutney on the side. The British love chutneys and added vinegar to them, but Indian chutneys are quite different. They're usually freshly cooked or raw ingredients that are blended. This one is definitely on the jammy side. Some of you may also be familiar with Trattoria Camillo, which is very close here in Borgo San Jacopo. This is a Florentine institution. It has that same air about it like Harry's, of an unchanged classic atmosphere. They also have a curry dish on their menu, and it is their signature dish. I was so intrigued about this. The first time I went to Camillo, I asked them, what should I order? And they said, well, you should order the curry because that's our signature dish. And I have to admit, I didn't order it because I thought, why would I eat curry in Florence? You know, but I should have listened more of it to that story. So I phoned Chiara Mazziero, who is the owner now. It was her grandfather, Camillo, who first founded the restaurant in 1944. It was destroyed the following year when Borgo San Jacopo, many of the buildings and the bridges in Florence were bombed. And then they moved in 1945 to the location where they are now on Borgo San Jacopo, which is very close to the Ponte Santa Trinita. And Chiara recounted to me the evolution of this curry in their restaurant. So it has a lot to do with Harry's Bar, actually. Harry's Bar was not very far away. It was just on the other side of the river. And at that time, it seems incredible, but in 1950s Florence, Borgo San Jacopo, sorry, the Oltrarno and where Borgo San Jacopo is, this side of the river, was not very built up. It was seen as a much less refined area. It was definitely the artisans' quarter. It was quite scruffy. So it was harder to get clientele, a certain type of clientele, to come across the bridge to eat on this side of the river. Amazing when you think about that now, right? But the position where Camillo is now, so close to the bridge, meant that it was only really a hop, skip and a jump from Harry's Bar to here. And Chiara's father, who was from Bologna, the fact that she thinks made him stand out in Florence. She says, sapeva fare. He knew how to charm the clients. He was full of initiatives. He added another room to the restaurant, and things were going really well. And word of mouth led to many clients coming across the bridge and coming to eat at Camillo, including some of the British customers from Harry's Bar. And they would come over and ask Chiara's father to prepare them the same creamy chicken curry with pilaf and mango chutney. So it became a fixture on the menu in the 1950s, and it still is. I have this 30-year-old guide of Florence. This was written in 1992. And it's a fantastic little book of restaurants from Florence. It's very interesting to read back through this and see, what was popular, what the restaurant was like. You'll see many of the same restaurants that are in here. In Camillo's section, you'll see there's a scampi al curry with rice. And so that was one of their signature dishes that has remained on the menu. It is strikingly similar to Harry's dish. It's also served with the same rice and the mango chutney. The curry powder that they use at Camillo is a secret blend. And the mango chutney is actually Chiara's own recipe. She had to invent it in the 1980s when suddenly they couldn't get the chutney that they were importing anymore. And so she looked at the back of an old jar and saw the list of ingredients and made it herself. I just find this really wonderful. And although some may scoff at the idea of eating a curry in Florence, it just, especially in like a very traditional Florentine trattoria or in such a classic place like Harry's Bar, I think that, this dish has its own story, and it really is a very Florentine story. Now, this is a dish I wanted to include, Zuppa Inglese, because it's quite obvious. I mean, it has the name Inglese, English soup, in it. But actually, I personally don't think that this is a British dish or a British inspired dish. A lot of people will compare it to trifle for obvious reasons. It looks a lot like a trifle. But I'll go through a few things here that I think point to it being actually an Italian dish. So Elizabeth David called the Zuppa Inglese a trifle much glorified. It's made of sponge cake or Savoiardi biscuits, ladyfinger biscuits, that are steeped in alcohol, usually in Florence, well, in Tuscany anyway. This is done with alchemes. It's a Florentine liqueur, and it gives it that pink color that you see in this Zuppa Inglese here. It's also got, it's layered with pastry cream, and sometimes whipped cream or chocolate as well. sometimes also fruit, but not as often as you'd find like in a trifle, for example. It has kind of a murky history, this dish. There's a lot of, there are a lot of legends and not very much in the way of firsthand documentation. And many regions also claim this as their own. Tuscany, Emilia-Romagna, Le Marche, much of central Italy has some form of a zuppa inglese. Many people assume that it has British origins, or that it had something to do with the 19th century expats in Florence, because of the similarity to trifle and the name with the word English in it. It's understandable. But I think that it actually dates back centuries. So the first English trifle appears in a cookbook from 1585. I made a little timeline. I will mention that this is what I have here, that the etymology zuppa is a soup, but it also comes from the word suppa, which means to dip bread in something wet, you know, to a sopped piece of bread, basically the same word that we use for sop. So the first trifle recipe doesn't appear until 1585, but you have in 1552, there's a legend where the Duke Cosimo de' Medici was served a dish that they called the Zuppa del Duca. And in 1557, this is a posthumously printed recipe book of Cristoforo di Messiburgo. He died in 1548, so this would have been, you know, written obviously before he died, so it would have been even earlier. And he has this zuppa magro inglese, and it is basically an egg thickened broth poured over slices of bread, and the whole thing is dusted with sugar and cinnamon. And it's called a zuppa magra inglese. So the Cosimo de' Medici legend, the idea there is he was served this zuppa del Duca in Siena. It was a great hit, and this zuppa del Duca made its way to Florence, where apparently it was beloved by the English expatriates in Florence, and then it became known as Zuppa Inglese because they loved it so much. There is another story. I think this one is quite charming, but really dubious anecdote, but it is quite a nice story. This is from the Oxford Companion to Sugar and Sweets. And in this story, they say the Zuppa Inglese is an Italian version of trifle, and that it originated in Italy, in Naples. So it was served apparently in the late 1700s at a banquet given by the King of Naples in honor of an English admiral called Horatio Nelson. In this anecdote, this dessert of stale sponge cake, hastily revived with rum and layered with pastry cream, was slapped together after a waiter dropped the original dessert destined for the admiral and was sent from the kitchen with the command, "Porta questa zuppa all'inglese." And that supposedly inspired the dessert's name. I dug up another account, which I think is very interesting. This is from Gladys Gretton's, the English woman in Italy, from 1860. And she was an expat. She'd been living in Italy for at least 10 years when she wrote this book. And in this particular, on this particular page, she's describing a wedding feast. This has got more of it here, the pigeons and the quantities of meat and everything else. And a lot of her book is about discussing the differences between British culture and Italian culture. That is really the main thing that she's talking about throughout this whole book. And in this particular chapter with the wedding feast, she's describing all of these, you know, local habits that she finds really, really interesting, and comparing them to British habits. The bemused Gretton notes that Zuppa Inglese is named for a national British fondness for alcohol, but she otherwise makes no hint of it being anything but a local dessert. She actually says here that sweet dishes they do not seem to care for, excepting sometimes Zuppa Inglese, sponge cake soaked in rum and covered with custard, so named in compliment to our national taste for ardent spirits, supposed indispensable to a Briton's daily refection. It could be that the name actually comes from the use of crema inglese. So there's this idea, it could come from the British love of alcohol. It could come from the British love of the dessert in general. It could come from the use of the crema inglese. And this only works when you read Artusi's recipe though. So I'll explain in a minute. As we mentioned, the crema inglese is the pouring custard made. So it's a much thinner custard than the usual pastry cream that you would see Zuppa Inglese made with today. It doesn't have any starch in it. For Artusi, Zuppa Inglese is a Tuscan dessert. As we've seen, he always attributes his British recipes. He'll explain it. He calls them all'inglese with the A-double-L, so in the English way. And he usually, in his head note, describes something about the dish being English. But in Zuppa Inglese, he doesn't say this at all. Artusi notes that crema inglese is used by the Tuscans to make Zuppa Inglese. And although that this is a much more delicate dessert, he thinks it makes it too runny. So instead, in his recipe, he uses crema pasticcera, the pastry cream, which is thickened with starch, which allows the cook to unmold the zuppa from the vessel. Apparently, make it look something different, like a cake. Of course, there's also the simple explanation that the similarities between trifle and Zuppa Inglese are just mere coincidence. Dipping sponge cake in alcohol and topping it with custard is not an entirely original idea. And if you think about many desserts across the Italian peninsula, you'll see a similarity here that they quite like doing this. In Naples, you have baba al rum, which is a sweet yeasted bread swimming in a rum syrup, often topped with pastry cream. There's, of course, the tiramisu from Treviso, invented in the 1960s. And even Sicily's cassata, sponge cake soaked in marsala and layered with ricotta cream. As Julian Riley observes in the Oxford Companion to Italian Food, from dunking cake or biscuits in a dessert wine, it was but a short step to layering them in a dish, soaked with wine, liqueurs, or fruit, and dousing them with custard or cream. And I think that this is probably the best explanation of the origins of this classic Tuscan English soup. So there you have it. This is my roundup of English connections in Florentine food. I hope it's given you some food for thought, or perhaps even just inspired you to go and try a very Florentine curry. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Emiko. That was a wonderful survey, full of insight. I'd forgotten just how big the British colony was here in the second half of the 19th century. So we obviously had an influence over all sorts of things which are now mainstream Florentine. So I'll ask Sarah to, there you go, she's done it. Welcome everyone from the Zoom. Nice to see you all, or some of you. And now we do the Q&A in the usual way. So usual rules, if you're in the room and would like to make a comment, ask a question, put your hand up and I'll bring you the microphone. If you're on the Zoom, you can either put something up on the comments and I'll read it out on your behalf. Or if you'd like to talk to us, which we love, just unmute yourself and say something and we'll hear you in the room. So that'd be great. So open the floor. Anyone in the room or on the Zoom would like to make a contribution? Everyone uncharacteristically shy. Here we are, we got one. Yeah.
Davies, what's your favorite Tuscan dish to make for people who come to visit you in Florence that really knocks our socks off?
That is a really good question. I often make people gnudi. And the reason for this is because, people love eating pasta, but, there aren't a lot of typical Florentine pasta dishes, actually. There's many more soups and things as primi, but the pasta, isn't as historical as some other dishes. And gnudi, I find, are great. And they really show off two great ingredients that you get here in Florence, which is ricotta, which is one of those things that, I think outside of Italy, you just don't get quite as good as the one that you have here. And spinach and greens, which are really, really classic Florentine vegetable as well. And so far, I've had no complaints. I think people really do like the gnudi as well.
I have a question which I'm going to ask. I was interested in your thesis that it was the cookbook Artusi written by a Florentine, which helped to promote the Florentine dialect as the national language. It's an interesting thesis, but my experience is that as you go around Italy, the most difficult language of all is all around food, because it's there's so many variations. The same thing is called something different in every town and village throughout the whole country. So I'm just interested in your thoughts on that dichotomy. Yeah.
Yeah, that is true. In fact, I think that the glossary that Artusi has at the back of the book is quite an interesting thing to include it, in an Italian cookbook, that you have to have a Tuscan glossary of these particular vegetables and these particular cuts of meat, and the names of the kitchen utensils even. I mean, it must have been an extraordinary feat to have to bring out a cookbook when people don't even know what cuts of meat you're talking about or what tools to use. And I think that, yeah, it is true that food has its own language, and particularly region to region. I do think that Artusi's book, though, having had the success that it did, from all over Italy, that you find, it really did something to make certain dishes very well known across all of Italy. Not so much the regional ones, but definitely he was Tuscan biased. So,
do we have anyone on the Zoom who's anxious to join in? I can just open up the chat so we can see that. Okay. There's something coming through on the chat which I'll read out. Robbie, to everyone, are there any other significant culinary imports, borrowed recipes in Florentine history from other nearby countries, for example, France and Germany?
So I would say that not so much borrowed. I think that Florentines would have this this argument to say that the Florentines brought many of their dishes and many of their vegetables and ways of cooking to France. So not that the French came and delivered their things here. And the reason for that is because of Catherine de' Medici. And she was a Florentine noblewoman. She became the Queen of France, and she was famously, a buona forchetta. She loved eating and she loved dishes, her Florentine dishes, and she brought with her her entourage of Florentine cooks. Came with her to France. So the Florentines will tell you that they invented, sorbet and crepes and a whole lot of other things, but they're also usually credited with having brought over Florentine vegetables to France. So things like artichokes and spinach and all those greens. If you look around the market right now in winter, you'll see just like, the piles and piles of greens. This is really what Tuscan vegetables are. And have you noticed there are many dishes that we call Florentine, eggs Florentine, as opposed to eggs Benedict, eggs Florentine, or those dishes that have the word Florentine attached to them in English or in French. Those are dishes that have spinach in them. And that is named after the Florentine that brought them over there.
Oh, thank you. We're going to go to a question from Jennifer in a moment, but before we do that, it's that time of the evening when I remind everyone that the Institute is an independent, standalone nonprofit with no public or government funding whatsoever. So we survive on our wits, and those who registered to come to the room pay up front, and those on the Zoom are welcome to join us without charge, but we do ask you if you would make a donation of whatever size you're comfortable with. And particularly this month, if you could go a bit deep into your pockets, it'd be appreciated, because we want to make a meaningful donation to the Red Cross. So over to Jennifer.
Hi. So what about Florentines, which we get in England, which are biscuits, what we call, not the Americans call cookies, which have almonds and cherries and things?
Yeah, that's a cookie that I've looked into as well, because I've actually seen them now. I think just now some bakeries are starting to make Florentines, but obviously these, these very lacy cookies that usually have nuts and chocolate on them are not a traditional Tuscan cookie. If you look at Tuscan cookies, they are hardy, they are built to last, and you can travel with them, you can throw them at windows, they're not like delicate lacy pastries. The Florentine cookies definitely have a history that is probably more towards France or Austria, and and definitely not Florentine. But why they were named after Florence, I'm not quite sure.
And the other question I wanted to ask you is about roast beef. Roast beef cooked Italian style or Florentine style has nothing to do with popping a roast into the oven in England.
Yeah.
It's our go-to for entertaining, and it's cooked in a saucepan on top of the stove with white wine and sage. I don't know whether that's what you do, but this is how I've been taught by butchers and whatever. It's the cut I'm intrigued, and maybe people who cook are interested, it's called a bicchiere, or it's called, I've forgotten the words now.
Girello is another word.
Girello is a different cut, but Scanello is another. Which would you use, and which, because they have a different texture and all tastes. So that was my question.
Yeah. So in the Caterina Prato's book, she says to use the lombata as well, which would be the same as a bistecca. I usually go to my butcher and I just tell him what I'm making and let him pick something for me. But it's usually I use often the girello, and that point that you just said is something that I've always found curious as well. And I've argued with my mother-in-law about this, the preparation of roast beef, because in Italy, it is done in a pan on the stovetop. And she was, telling me all her friends do it that way. And this is how it's done. And I said, but roast means it's in the oven, and you actually put it in an oven dish and you bake it in the oven. And she didn't believe me. But that is just one of the things that I think, maybe they changed to suit the cut and the way that they're cooking here, and produce something that is quite similar. I mean, in the end you have a piece of meat that looks like it's roasted, and it is quite similar.
I think there's another one on the comments. Roslow, congratulations on a decision to give money to Ukraine. Thanks, Ros. So Christine, did the recipe book by Janet Ross, Leaves from a Tuscan Garden, not sure if that's the title, in the late 19th century have any impact on the Italian or British community? Do you know that book?
I do, and I love that cookbook. And one of the reasons why I do love Janet Ross is that she lived very close to where I've been living for in Florence, which is in Settignano. It's called Leaves from a Tuscan Kitchen. And I think that cookbook, it's all Italian recipes. It was written in English, and apparently it was written by her chef. So she helped write it, obviously, but the recipes were her Florentine chef's recipes. So I don't think it really had any impact on the Italian community, because it was only written in English, and they were Italian recipes anyway. But I don't know if that became a well-known book in England. Perhaps it really was like a book that would have enticed people to come to Florence, and it was just another sort of romantic book about eating in Florence. It is a vegetarian cookbook, which is quite interesting, I think. Yeah.
In the room.
I was wondering if there are any other nationalities that Artusi incorporates into some of his recipes. You obviously focused on the British ones, but I was wondering if there was a similar focus on other countries.
Yeah, it is. I mean, he does have some dishes in here that are Hungarian, French, so he does mention, there is a German recipe. Somebody else asked about a German recipe in the comments here. There is something tedesco, in here as well. But I found the British recipes striking because there were so many of them. Yeah.
Have you got any more in the room? Anyone want to talk to us from Zoom? Anything else in the comments? Okay. Hello, we can hear you loud and clear.
Hello. Who, me? Yeah. Hey.
You want to say something? Yeah.
Whoop. No, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Oh, okay. I'm sorry. I just wanted to say this cookbook was offered to me as a gift by a Florentine Nona, which I think speaks volumes for your experience. And you're so sweet to share so much with all of us on your Instagram feed. For those of you who don't follow, it's a must. It's just makes my day. I thank you so much.
Thank you. That's very sweet. That's a really great compliment. Thank you.
Mary Jane was holding up the book Florentine, which is Emiko's first and highly successful.
Yeah, and given to me by a Florentine grandmother. So I think that means a lot.
Thank you. That's a terrifically good note. And if there aren't any further questions, it might be a good note to end on, because it's brings it full circle why we've been absolutely delighted to have Emiko with us this evening. So thank you for your time. Thank you. I'm afraid we have to say goodbye to our friends on the Zoom in the hope that you'll be able to come and join us here in Florence before too long. There are signs that the pandemic emergency is coming towards an end in Florence. And one of the signs which we're going to enjoy here in the library now is that we are again allowed to serve wine tonight. Hallelujah to that. And I think once we get into April and beyond, things will start to ease up. So do come on back and visit us. We'd love to see you here. So thanks to all the Zoomers. And for those in the room, we're going to have a glass of wine now. I urge you to help by pushing the chairs a bit to one side so we can open up the space and keep a little bit of social distancing whilst we're chatting and having a glass of wine. And Emiko's books are here on sale at a special discount for you all from our friends at Paperback Exchange. Thank you for that. And Emiko, I think you will be happy to sign any books that people would like to acquire. Okay, so thank you, Emiko.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks.